I've been in France now since 1981, just after the elections which brought François Mitterrand to power in May of that year, and then a landslide for the Socialist and Communist Party majority in the legislative elections, which I think was in June of that year. And ever since then, I've seen these presidential and parliamentary elections come and go. But I must say, this last election for me is a very significant event. Now, I'm not one of those comrades who is given to predictions of revolution around the corner or of turning points and so on. Somebody once joked that there are so many turning points announced that you end up being in the same place as you were before, turning and turning and turning. But this, I believe, is a landmark election in many respects. And I do think that in the wake of these elections, in the months ahead, we are going to see some tremendous events in this country, because this election shows what we've already said and analysed before the election took place, the enormous tensions which are building up inside French society. And the keynote of all those tensions is, whether it's on the extreme right or the extreme left or on the left, is an enormous popular contempt and hostility for what is called over here the political class. You know, an enormous disillusionment in parties and in politicians. If you look at this election, we're just going back a little bit in time. We've had the COVID period, which sort of put a dampener on everything. But if we just go back to what was going on in France before the COVID crisis, with lockdowns and all kinds of restrictions and that kind of fixing the attention of the public on things other than normal political life. Remember that we had this mass movement, really, of the Gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests, which wasn't just the hundreds of thousands of people, ordinary people, involved in, I would say, demonstrations of a semi-insurrectional character, but it was also something like 70% of support in public opinion for that movement at the height of the movement. This was in a context where people were storming government buildings in the western part of Paris, that's to say the prestigious bourgeois governmental part of Paris. This was in the face of massive propaganda denouncing violence, anarchy, and so on and so forth. 70% of the population said, well, we're with these people, actually, and a lot of things they say, we feel them and agree with them too. We also had, around about the same time, the longest rail strike in the history of the country for a long time, which was a pretty solid strike, which wasn't completely defeated, and neither was it completely victorious. But that also showed a change in mood. And by the way, just a couple of months ago, there were strikes in the transport system in Paris, which again were rock solid. I've never seen for a long time, not since the 1980s, metro strikes where there were literally no metros and where practically all the stations were closed down, where there were very, very few buses, where the tramways were at a standstill. So that's been the situation leading up to these elections. And now we have this very remarkable set of results. And I'd like to just run through some of the main observations I would make about this election. In particular, the most instructive part of the election is the first round. One of the most remarkable features of the first round of the presidential election, where you had about 10 or 12 candidates presenting themselves, the thing which struck me most about the election was the collapse of the Socialist Party vote. Now, remember, the Socialist Party for decades was the obvious alternative, if you like, to a right-wing government. You would have other left-wing formations putting forward candidates, but it was always pretty clear if there wasn't going to be a right-wing government, it was going to be a government of the Socialist Party or of a left coalition in which the Socialist Party would be the main element. This time, the Socialist Party candidate, Anne Hidalgo, she got, 1.75% of the vote, which is actually less than the Communist Party vote. Now that for the Socialist Party is an absolutely disastrous score, and it really confirms the decline of the Socialist Party as a political force, at least on the national plane. They will probably do better than that in local elections. But even there, once a party really comes off very badly in a presidential election, the loss of prestige and credibility in the electorate generally expresses itself in all the other elections, regional elections, municipal elections, and so on throughout the, in the country. So this is a very significant development because, again, since Mitterrand, what happened with Mitterrand was for the first year, I would say, he did actually carry out quite an impressive program of social reform, including the reduction of the working week, the increase of the minimum wage, the lowering of the pensions age, new rights and more rights for trade union organizations, reforms in housing, reforms in social security. It was a very important program of social reform, which didn't obviously go as far as transforming society as he had promised to do, but it was nonetheless a very progressive period in French government. The following year, in 1982, he basically did an about turn and introduced what he called a policy of rigor, which we would call today of austerity, undoing some of the reforms he'd done in the first period, but generally speaking, just stopping any further social reform, and then launching a program of closures and a kind of downsizing of parts of French industry, in particular the steel industry and the coal mining industry, which had been important parts of the social basis of the socialist and communist government at the time. Ever since that time, the Socialist Party has played the same game as we've seen with so many Labour governments and left-wing governments throughout Europe. That is to say, they would present themselves as a force of social progress, of social welfare, of looking after the people, of doing, everything the right doesn't do, and, putting themselves forward as some sort of progressive alternative. But once they were in power, they turned against their own social base. The socialist government of 1977 to 2002 carried out the biggest privatization program in the history of the country at the time. It was 31 billion euros worth of public assets, which were handed over to the private sector. Some companies were even sold for a token €1 to capitalist interests. And generally speaking, all socialist governments since 1982 have based their policy on the preservation and defense of capitalist interests against the working people. And yet that was the only alternative. How did François Hollande, the last socialist president, come to power? Because of that. Well, if it's not the right, then that is all we have. And in spite of the record of the Socialist Party carried off that election against Sarkozy and won the presidential election. So this vote of, just a little bit more than, or less than 2% is a calamity for the Socialist Party. But from the point of view of the Labour movement, it really means that a major obstacle on our path has been, or is being, in the process of being removed. Because what we have now is the emergence, so the collapse of the Socialist Party and the emergence to the left of the Socialist Party of a viable left-wing movement in the form of La France Insoumise, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And really speaking, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, if you want to place his policy and his general position in a historical context, really he's retying the thread of the Mitterrandism of the late 70s and the early 80s. His policy is a policy of social reform, mixed in with a lot of Republican rhetoric, sometimes with a nationalistic tone to it. But it's a policy of social reform on wages, social security, health, housing, pensions, all the traditional themes of the left. So a progressive left reformist policy, similar in a way, although more sort of graphically and dramatically presented to the policy which Jeremy Corbyn defended in Britain, a left reformist program. So on the left, you've got the traditional right-wing socialist forces which have fallen through. and a surge behind and around La France Insoumise and around, in particular, the candidature of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So that's the development on the left. Now, if you look at what has happened on the right, it's a similar development, but in the opposite direction. The right-wing candidate of the candidate of the traditional right-wing party, I'm just looking for her, she got 4.78% in the first round, which is a very, very low score. And just bearing in mind, you have to get 5% in the presidential election to have any chance of seeing your election expenses reimbursed. So anything less than 5% is really considered as an also ran, as they say in the horse races, an anecdotal candidature. And Valérie Pécresse, who was the traditional right-wing's candidate. This party has changed its name several times over the years. In the 80s, it was the RPR, then it was the UMP, and now it's the Republicans, but it's the same formation. It's the old Gaullist right-wing formation, actually. They have also collapsed, and we have to their right a surge around the former National Front, and now it's called the Rassemblement National, which I suppose you could translate as National Rally or something like that, national movement. Rassemblement means a coming together, all right? The National Front, or the Rassemblement National, came through with 23.15% against Mélenchon's 21.95. He was just, a percentage and a half behind her, and Macron on the first round got almost 28%. So that's again an extremely significant development, because if we take these two parties together, the Socialist Party and what are now the Republicans, they were really the parties who would, like the first and second team, would just replace each other periodically to run capitalism along very similar lines. And political life, in terms of the institutions, has been dominated by these two parties for 50 years. And so the fact that also has collapsed is an extremely important development in French political history. Now, in the middle, we have this phenomena of Macronism. Now, Macron is a right-wing politician who was part of the leadership of the Socialist Party previously. When it was clear that the Socialist Party was going to lose the last elections, he broke away with a very sort of, he came across as having a fresher, younger, more modern approach, but in particular, he's considered, quite rightly, as the banker's man. That is to say, a complete and unashamed defense of capitalist interests, an espousing of this so-called trickle-down theory, where in order to help the poor, you must first make the rich even richer, as where there are big profits, where there is, when business is going well, then there's a beneficial effect for working people. This was his policy. And the first measure which he put in when he came into power was to abolish the wealth tax and, generally speaking, reduce taxation on enterprises and, the richest sections of the population, while at the same time, cutting pensions and attacking public services, and generally speaking, having a hostile attitude towards this former social conquest of the working people. So in the middle, we have this phenomena of Macronism. Macron won the elections in the second round. Possibly, I don't know, but if Mélenchon had actually got through to the second round, he might have won the election, actually, because of Macron's he's very unpopular. Mélenchon might have won and we might have had a left government, but, he just fell short of that on the first round, Mélenchon. But anyway, Macron has won now, but so, he's trumpeting his victory with 58%. But in fact, he only has a very, very narrow political base for a French president. As I say, he only got something like 28% of the vote on the first round. And now we'll have the legislative elections where his party, because it's a new party, really, it was a party formed of renegades from the right and the left, the Socialist Party and the Republican Party. who sort of rallied to his banner when they thought he was going to win, and he did win in the last elections, obviously. But it's a party which, therefore, doesn't really have anything of a real social base. You know, you get hardly any local branches of the Macron movement. It's very much him and his aura, and hardly any sort of political machinery behind him. You know, so he got what is a low score for a future president in the first round, and now we have these legislative elections where he might lose his parliamentary majority. And in fact, Mélenchon has even put himself forward as saying, if the left comes out on top in the legislative elections, he'd be prepared to be prime minister. Now, we do have this system in France where the president is elected separately from the MPs, you know, the members of parliament. There's the presidential election and then the legislative election. And we have had in history a few instances of what the French call cohabitation, where you would have a right-wing president and a left-wing parliamentary majority. That was the case between 1997 and 2002. Or you can have the opposite, a left-wing president, as was the case with Mitterrand and Chirac, who was the prime minister, on the basis of a right-wing parliamentary majority. So I haven't really thought that much about how possible that is, but it's not completely impossible that we'd have some sort of new cohabitation. What I do think is pretty certain is that Macron will, even if he doesn't lose his majority overall, he'll certainly take a beating in the legislative elections, because this mechanism which he took advantage of saying it's me or the National Front won't be coming into play in those particular elections, which are on a more local basis in the local constituencies. So it's going to be a weak presidency. He's a very unpopular president. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, had a party for my daughter's 5th birthday, and some of the parents who came around and brought their children around were talking about the elections, because it was election day, the day before yesterday. So, and you know, the Muslim mothers who came, they said to me, well, what do you think about this election? And I sort of shrugged my shoulders a little, and they said, really, it's the same thing, isn't it? And they weren't going to vote. And the reason for that is that Macron and Le Pen, what's going on between them? Macron, while he's been president, he's introduced openly racist legislation directly inspired from the National Front's program. In particular, he put forward a law, what he called the anti-separatism law, anti-separatist law, which quite clearly in its kind of preface designated what he calls the Muslim community, if we accept that such a thing exists, really, because there are all kinds of strands within that part of the population which is culturally or religiously associated with Islam. But he more or less designated that part of France as a sort of potential foreign body within the national organism. And the law is a law designed to warn the population, in a way, of the danger of Muslim separatism, if you like, which doesn't exist. And I won't go into the details of that, but it was clearly an attempt at divide and rule, to designate a foreign or potentially hostile internal enemy, to detract attention from the hostility to his own problems at home. On the other hand, the National Front, I'll just say that because it's easier than Rassemblement National, has tried, and with some success over recent years, to shed some of the more blatantly racist policies and become less flagrantly nationalist in its approach than it was in the preceding period. For instance, Marine Le Pen dropped the idea of leaving the European Union a little while ago, and as when there's been issues concerning the Muslim community or racism, she's actually spoken out against it in hypocritical terms, in order to try and distance herself from that openly racist past of the National Front. Now, what that means in a way is that I wouldn't like to use the term moving to the left on the part of an organization like the National Front, but it's what she's tried to do is introduce a lot of social themes, which you would normally associate with the left, like the defense of the minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage, things like this, building this into her program in order to put a sort of more socially conscious face to the policies which she's trying to defend. So she's moving, in inverted commas, to the left, or has been, whereas Macron has been slowly and quite strikingly on occasions adopting aspects of the National Front's racist policies. So really speaking, when people come around and say, especially from a Muslim background or an immigrant worker background, and say they're pretty much the same, actually, they're actually absolutely right. And we called on the second round for abstention or voting a blanc, a white vote, if you like, a blank vote, because we couldn't approve of either one of these candidates in the second round. I mean, when you have a two-round election like that, if the left is eliminated, it's no longer in the race, then it doesn't mean you do nothing, but you need to prepare for transferring the struggle from the electoral plane onto the industrial and social plane to combat the candidate who wins, whoever that might be. They're both enemies. Basically, it was two enemies fighting it out in the second round. Now, of course, that policy wasn't shared by all other left-wing formations. The Communist Party, which had stubbornly refused to support Mélenchon because he was too reformist, too moderate, to this and to that on the first round, then calls for a vote for Macron on the second round. What's the argument? Well, the argument is we need to form a barrage, a rampart against fascism. Now, Le Pen is not a fascist, and the National Front or the Rassemblement National is not a fascist organization. There are, less so now than in the past, but there are certain fascist elements inside that party, mainly sort of youth groups of, rather violent skinhead type fascists who go around beating up immigrants and sometimes organize operations against left-wing rallies and demonstrations. There are fascist elements in the National Front, but if we judge a party by its program and its overall orientation, the National Front is a very far cry from fascism. Now, sometimes when we say that, people say, you're soft on the National Front. Well, it's not that. It's that if you say that this is fascism, then you're being very soft on the fascists, because let's remember, fascism is the program of civil war, of the complete annihilation of democratic rights, destruction of the workers' movement. And there is none of this in the policy of the National Front. It's a right-wing party, a nationalist right-wing party, which has made its way using, divide and rule racist tactics. All of that is true, but it's not a fascist organization. And even if it was a fascist organization, you wouldn't rely on an individual like Macron as a barrier against the development of that movement. Basically, it's a right-wing party, like there are so many others in Europe, and therefore, we couldn't support one or the other. But I just want to conclude, if I've got just a few minutes left, on saying that, this election's taken place in a period of extreme social tension. The COVID period has led to an increase in social inequality. According to what your circumstances were, you could, survive more or less the extreme economic hardships which fell down on a large part of the population during this period, with people on short-time working, losing their jobs, all kinds of difficulties arising because of this pandemic. So there's a feeling of exhaustion and of uncertainty, vulnerability about the future. So it's a very charged atmosphere. Almost everyone you talk to has something to say about politics. And the phrase which they always use in French is "ça va péter." In other words, one day or another, it's going to explode. This country is going to explode. You can hear everyone say that. The butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, the taxi drivers, anybody will, that will come out in a conversation whenever you're talking about the situation in the country. And one of the reflections of that attitude of sort of wariness and hostility towards all those people up there who can't really find a solution and who are only making things worse and who are using red herrings and false flags to try and divert opinion. One expression of that is the very high level of abstention. I think the abstention in the second round was higher than in the first round, and it came out at about 28%, to which you have to add maybe 7 or 8% of people who went to the polls but left their bulletin blank. They didn't want to vote for either side. So you're probably talking about something like, 37, 38% of the electorate that didn't vote. And I think we should be on guard characterizing that as just sort of political apathy or not caring about politics. If you talk to the people who don't vote, it's not just that they're too lazy to go to the polls or they want to do something else with their Sunday, but there's a consciousness. No solution is going to come out of elections, of voting, of the present sort of staffing of the political world. And that idea is not a prejudice or an expression of any sort of political backwardness. There is a certain amount of that, obviously, but it's a political stand. And that idea actually is fundamentally correct. None of the basic problems which the French people are facing will be solved by an election victory in itself, whether it be won by the left or the right. I think that all these elements, together with the economic context, we've got this war between Russia and the Ukraine, which is having huge economic fallout internationally on the prices of grain, of food in general, on the price of fuel, on prices generally. Prices have increased and are increasing, quite dramatically in French supermarkets. And you've got a lot of people who are already on the edge who will just find that they're being pushed over the edge by this inflation. People's savings are being worn away by the inflation which is setting in. Wages are no longer going to be worth what they used to be. And now you have Mr. Macron, who says one of his most important measures, the urgent measures, is to take away the emergency payments which are made to the poorest sections of the population if they don't find work. If they don't find at least 15 or 20 hours work a week, their emergency payments will be stopped. So you add in all these factors into the mix. And I think that in the wake of this election, and I'm not talking about years ahead, but more like months ahead or weeks ahead, I think you'll find that all this pent-up tension in society is going to find an expression, and probably we'll be saying in a few months from now that the Gilets jaunes was only a general rehearsal for what is waiting for us. If Macron really attacks those emergency payments, it means whole sub-parts of the suburbs around our big cities are going to be, from one day to another, reduced to abject poverty. And that means riots. It means, movements in the streets. And I think this election is really announcing a period of extreme social turbulence with, yes, nationalistic, fascist movements emerging on one side, but above all, an awakening of the working people and a determination for social change. Just the final word, if you look at the results overall, whether it be the Rassemblement National or Mélenchon or the other electorally smaller left-wing formations, which, together amassed about maybe 7, 8, 9% of the votes. What all of these votes mean, almost all of them, is a profound desire for something to change. And that really is a fact of enormous potentially revolutionary significance.